Good evening, and welcome to an evening with Janette Turner Hospital. I'm sure you're all as excited as I am to be here tonight. I'm Jo Case, and I'm the staff writer and editor here at the Wheeler Centre. Janette Turner Hospital is a Melbourne-born writer who grew up in Queensland. She's lived all over the world, including India, Canada, France and the United States. She taught at the University of South Carolina for 12 years, where she held an endowed chair as Carolina Distinguished Professor of English. She's also taught at Columbia University in New York and many other places around the world. Janette is the author of 8 novels and 4 short story collections. Her books have been published in multiple languages. I'll just mention a few of her many achievements here, otherwise we won't have long to talk. She published her first novel, The Ivory Swing, set in India and first published in Canada in 1982. The Last Magician, her 5th novel, was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. Oyster, her 6th novel, was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin. In 2003, she won the Queensland Premier's Literary Award for Due Preparations for the Plague, and she won the Patrick White Award. Her most recent novel is Orpheus Lost, which has been extremely well reviewed, and her latest book is the wonderful collection Forecast Turbulence. Welcome, Janette.
Thank you, Jo. I have to tell you, I don't know if you've ever sat up on a stage under floodlights, but it's like having a little like having your eyes scorched with this incredibly powerful floodlight. But what it does do is cast the most wonderful golden glow over all of you. So, I'm seeing you in a radiant fog.
It's a very attractive audience, isn't it?
Beautiful.
Janette, reading your fiction is such an intellectual adventure. It's so rich with ideas, but your characters are very compelling too, which isn't always the case with novels of ideas, I think. They have such acute psychological underpinnings, and you give them great lines. I wonder, where do you start when you're writing, with the characters or with the ideas?
That depends a bit on whether it's a novel or a short story, because for me, novels really are explorations of ideas. All my novels begin very suddenly, like a cricket ball on the side of the head, when when a certain image collides with a burning question that I feel I need to know the answer to, but don't know the answer to, and I feel I have to find it out. As soon as that collision occurs, I know it's going to be a novel, and it's going to take a few years, from 3 to 5 years. Stories, on the other hand, short stories, and so I know from the moment of inception whether it's going to be a short story or a novel. And the things that become short stories sometimes are characters, people, with a germination point in real life, although I always take great, great care to protect the privacy of anyone I'm writing about. One way is by waiting many years. It's often 30 or more years before something that I feel needs to be set the way a diamond is set in a ring, to be preserved and remembered, but it can take a very long time for me to figure out how to do it, which in itself is a safety device, because by that time the connection, especially when you move countries, as often as I have, the connection is broken. But I also do things like radically changing the age or the gender of the person, if what I'm after is the essence of some intense emotional state. So I'm sure that's a very unsatisfactory answer.
No,
which is usually the way I answer questions, by sliding out of them.
No, it's, exploring them. And I was going to ask you about the difference between your novels and short stories and how they start, so you've answered that for me. It's interesting what you say about your stories. Sometimes you have ideas from real life that take a long time to germinate, because I did read that one of the stories in Forecast, Turbulent, that came from an idea when you were visiting a prison in Canada?
Not visiting a prison. One of the things about moving countries, not done intentionally. We didn't set out to say, let's become nomads for life. It didn't happen that way. It just was the nature of our careers and graduate education. But there's an unfortunate side effect, and that is every time you move countries, and sometimes even state to state or province to province within a country, your credentials from the last place are not recognised, and you have to re-credential yourself or change careers, which is why I've had quite a few truncated careers. But when we were in Canada, and I was doing a PhD in medieval literature, living in a small college town, 3 hours one way to Toronto, 3 hours the other way to Montreal, never a great call for medievalists. And there were 4 tenured ones at that university. So I was, and they weren't close to dying. So I was taking whatever job was available. And I taught in a maximum security prison for men and a medium security prison. However, there was only one in Canada maximum security prison who was a woman in special quarters. And the reason, she had never harmed another human being, she had never stolen anything. The reason she had become a maximum security prisoner was that she was very gifted at harming herself, at mutilating herself. She cut herself constantly. She used anything that she could, from a broken plastic knife to a broken bobby pin. So everything possible was done to prevent her from harming herself. And I found it, as I'm sure you all do, incomprehensible. Why, what does it mean? How can somebody do this to themselves? And I knew and gradually found out more about her really terrible childhood, subjected to a lot of physical and sexual abuse, and then sent to reform school where she had more abuse, and then in prison she'd been raped by a guard. It was just an endless horror story. But I thought, so why would someone who'd had that much horror in their lives, why would they want to inflict further pain on themselves? It made no sense at all. Until she said, it doesn't hurt. It's just there's so much pain inside of you that you have to let it seep out. And then you begin to feel better, which just blew my mind at the time. Now, that's more than 30 years ago, and I always knew that somehow I would want to write about that in a way that tried to make something meaningful and beautiful out of this dreadfully desecrated and self-desecrated life. And it's taken these 30 years for me to figure out how to do it. If I tried to do it at the time, which in fact I just don't think I could have, I was so anguished myself about this. So it took that long for me to figure out a way to tell that story in a kind of deadpan voice, a survivor's voice. Though, in fact, that young woman herself didn't survive. She did manage to kill herself eventually, in spite of all the efforts that were made to prevent it. And I'm sure for her, that was such relief. But I wanted to make something meaningful and beautiful out of that life, and so that's what the story Weather Maps is about. But it could only possibly ever have been a short story because I couldn't bear to stay with it for longer than 5 or 6 pages, and you couldn't bear to read it for more than that either. You
have. I've heard you say that in your fiction you like end with a note of redemption, and I suppose
I insist on, I think, my credo is I despair, therefore I insist on hope. There's just so much horror in the world right now, from Syria to individual lives in pain, that you've got to believe in hope. And I also very, very strongly believe in quite flawed human beings, which, after all, we all are, to one degree or another, that very flawed and damaged human beings can have moments of offering amazing redemptive possibilities and hope and salvific nurturing to other flawed human beings. And they're the moments that I treasure and the ones that I like to write about.
And that is one of the wonderful things about your fiction, I think, that characters are almost never entirely, they're always somewhat flawed, somewhat good. There's always, they reflect the way human beings are, nuanced, and that's a wonderful thing.
Well, in fact, it's the nature of writing, of course, that to make a character vivid, and in the act of writing, you are really, as with an actor, you are trying to put yourself in somebody else's skin. And, that takes a lot of thought and empathy and sometimes research too. And once you put yourself inside somebody else's skin, of course you begin to feel the way they did. So I've only once ever had one truly evil character, and that's the character of Oyster. In that novel, and he's based on the cult messiah figure, Jim Jones and the Guyana Kool-Aid mass suicides and David Koresh at Waco, Texas. And I never could get inside his skin, because that's the thing about psychopaths, which he is. They have no self. And so all I could do was kind of circle him, because they wreak terrible devastation in the lives of others. So all I could do was circle that character, who was like a gravitational black hole, sucking in lives and destroying them. And it was actually quite a frightening book to write, and probably is to read too. In fact, people have told me that they had to put it down, they couldn't finish it. Because I felt I was being sucked into this life, and that I mightn't get out, that I'd got into the gravitational force field and would be just scrunched up. So, but that was because I couldn't get inside that character. And there are evil people. There are people who seem to me to be absolutely evil, I think. But there aren't many of them. Mostly people have the capacity for doing good and for doing harm.
I think the one other character of yours that I thought was a psychopath, actually, a clinical psychopath perhaps, was Sirocco in due preparations for the plague, who was the terrorist.
You're right. I just repressed the fact that I'd done it twice.
Sorry. But that was also just so disturbing to read, but also fascinating, because you never knew what he was going to do next, because he kind of wasn't motivated by those things that motivate most of us and most of your characters, which are very...
Of course, that was written when hostage takings and the World Trade Towers and all of that, and I do, that is beyond me to understand someone who could slash a stewardess's throat with a box cutter on an airplane. I can't get into that space, and I don't want to get into it.
No. One of the fascinating things about that book was, though, that you had another character, or other characters who were involved in terrorism. You had the CIA agent who came very close to crossing, well, he did cross lines, but so you did get an insight into how some of those dark things can happen from the point of view of a character involved. But you could, there were motivations there.
And there were consequences for that CIA character of personal psychic disintegration. That idea came or the realization of that came to me many years ago when one of the books that I consider in a major way life-changing for me was reading The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, which I read in the early 60s. And he was a black Algerian psychiatrist in the French army, and this was during the very brutal French-Algerian War, the War of Algerian Independence. And the Algerians fighting for independence were being tortured regularly. You know, it was sort of the method to stop the insurrection and to stop the terrorists, not unlike what's been happening in Libya and Syria. And he, as an army psychiatrist who was Algerian, but was an officer in the French army and thought of himself as French, as of course did Camus, who also was Algerian and French, he was required to, as a psychiatrist, to counsel, to have as patients both victims of torture and the torturers. And although he certainly doesn't in any way, and nor do I, equate the kinds of suffering by any means, there's no moral equality there. But in a way, it's reassuring to know that the torturers do not get off psychically scot-free, that the torturers couldn't shut out the sound of screams in their ears, and they wanted counseling to deal with this. So brutality is never without consequences for both sides of the equation, I think. And that's the sort of murky thing that novelists tend to explore, I guess. Absolutely, and I guess that psychiatrist was in the position that novelists put themselves in, where you do need to look into both sides. Yeah. I wanted to ask, you said you've been interested in exploring resilience in your work throughout your fiction, and I wondered, because your fiction is so very dark but then does end on that redemptive note, do you sometimes push your characters into horrific situations or dilemmas to see how they will find their way out of them? I don't feel that I push my characters into anything. I feel that I have brushed up against many dark life stories through teaching in prisons, through living in a village in South India, just through all kinds of ways. And because also, I don't know, I sometimes think I'm a kind of magnetic force field for people to tell me their stories. I am an avid listener, and I don't interrupt, and particularly on long flights, because I'm incredibly interested in people's lives. I find them endlessly interesting. And on long flights, when people are plied with free alcohol, and they're sitting next to someone that they don't know from Adam or Eve, and they talk very, very freely. And I don't really say anything. I just listen and nod, fascinated, thinking, this is going to be a short story. And usually after lengthy conversation at some point, usually when you're getting ready to disembark, they say, oh, and what do you do? And I say, well, actually, I'm a writer, I'm a novelist. And I'm always expecting to say, if you use any of this, I'm going to sick my lawyer onto you. And I've never had that reaction. And it's kind of touching, the reaction I do get. What people say is, I've always thought my life would make an interesting book. I think people really want their stories to be told. And of course, I usually never find out their names or anything about them, so they feel pretty safe, I guess. And when I am using stories about people I have known, I take great concern ethically to make sure that they're not exposed. And so people I have had in mind, as far as I can tell, have not at all realized, because we're rather slow to recognize certain things about ourselves. But people I have not remotely had in mind have often come to me and said, I told you that story, didn't I, about that you used it in my book. So.
Oh, that's interesting. I was interested, as you were talking about that, that sounds like a fabulous toolkit for a writer to have, that listening and having people tell you stories. And I was reading that as a child you grew up in a religious household where there was no television and no radio. And
now, mind you, I'm old enough that there wasn't television anywhere up until I would have been in high school. But it's true, we didn't have a radio, and I was 20 years old before I saw a movie.
Really? Wow.
It was, yes, it was religiously very circumscribed, but it was a very loving family, and a fun-loving family. I know that's sort of hard for people to believe when I say I hadn't seen a movie. We didn't have a radio. We went to church 3 times on Sunday, morning, afternoon service, and evening service. And that part of it, I must admit, was pretty dull. But my family had a great rollicking sense of humour, and my dad was a wonderful storyteller. And when we were young kids, I have 3 younger brothers, I'm the oldest, and we all slept in the same bedroom for quite a long time because it was a very small house across from the railway line in Brisbane. And we had bunk beds that Dad built, and every night after work, and Dad did... My dad is someone who should have been a school teacher. His father was a country headmaster in Victorian schools. So Dad grew up in all these one-teacher country Victorian schools. Edenhope, Kai Valley, anyone from those places here? They are very rich in my mind because he told so many stories about them. But the Depression and the war really interfered with Dad's life, and he didn't finish high school. And he became a house painter. That's what he did. You know, and there are snobby times in my life when I've felt like saying my father was a painter, which is true. But he would come in very weary at the end of a day's heavy physical labour and sit on the end of one of the beds and tell these wonderful long-running serials that he made up as he went along. And we always wanted, you know, we're waiting for the next night to hear the next part of the story. And he was endlessly inventive. So I think my love of telling stories came from that. And I have, because I'm very proud of my dad, who's 96 and very, very frail, in Brisbane. When he was in his 60s, I convinced him, because he'd always loved books, he was an amazing autodidact and self-taught piano player, that he should apply for a mature standing at the University of Queensland, which he really wanted to, was dead scared of doing. But I, by that time, had several friends I'd been at uni with who were teaching there. So we cajoled him into doing this, and he did a BA in his late 60s and an MA in his 70s in Australian Lit. After which I was hoping, after he'd read Ulysses, that he wouldn't be quite so shocked by what I wrote. But he did tell me that although he was very proud of the first book, which I think is the only one he's read, because he didn't want to be shocked, he said he was very proud of me, but he did find the book morally repulsive. That's because of the sex scenes, I think, and the language.
Oh, that's all right. You know, sometimes you want to shock your parents a bit anyway, right? You've said that that world that you grew up in at home was very different from most people around you, and when you went to school, that you had to become an acute observer to learn to fit in, and you were really moving between different worlds. And I wondered if you think that influenced you becoming a writer, or the kinds of things
Oh, definitely,
you write about.
I think. I mean, I had to be an acute observer and listener just to decode the rules of school, because, you know, everybody would talk about radio programs and the races. I didn't know what the races was, but everybody, and I can remember in Queensland schools anyway, for the Melbourne Cup, which I didn't know what that was. I knew what cups in Melbourne looked like, but didn't really know. You have no idea if you have no radio, if you're just disconnected from the world. It's all a great big puzzle, and you don't know what these terms mean. And so I had to gradually piece together what they meant, and the teachers would stop classes and put the radio on the school table for the running of the Melbourne Cup, and the teachers and the kids would make penny or threepenny bets. Well, I knew betting was wrong. I knew gambling was wrong. So I was always the weirdo alien outsider kid. So it turned out to be good training for the rest of my life, always being the newcomer. So yes, it makes you a good listener, a good observer, and you have to explain things to yourself. And one of the ways of doing that is by writing. Long before I ever occurred to me that I would write short stories or novels to be published, I was a voluminous letter writer. I used to write to my grandmother back in Melbourne for years after we moved to Brisbane. And actually for years after everybody else had stopped writing letters. I was such a voluminous letter writer to a very dear friend who'd been a librarian with me at Harvard, and then she went back to London, and I missed her terribly because we used to walk around Cambridge, Massachusetts, just talking about literature at lunchtime, and I missed her greatly when she went. And so I would write these long letters, missing these discussions. And she was a very interesting person, but not a letter writer. And finally, she, after a long time would elapse, and then she would answer wonderfully interesting long letters. And I would immediately answer again. And finally, she sent me a postcard that said, "Please do not answer this postcard. I am in a permanent state of owing you a letter, and I just can't handle it anymore." But, writing was the way I kept a record of things and made sense of things.
From everything you're saying, surely no one was shocked when you wrote a novel. Must have been leading up to it.
I really only did it out of a dearth of options. It was not something I thought I'd get around to doing or thought about it at all. I did love writing, but it never occurred to me or to any of my teachers that this was something anybody could become. None of my teachers even said to me, "You're so good at English, you should become a journalist," because as far as I know, and as far as any of my teachers knew, there were no female journalists in Queensland at the time, certainly. They all said, "You must become an English teacher," which is what I did become.
Oh, there are worse things, I guess. My parents are English teachers, so that is in no way saying it's a loving joke.
So it wasn't until we were in this village in South India that I was homeschooling our children and living in very beautiful space which we visited just a couple of weeks ago again. About 8 degrees from the equator, surrounded by rice paddies, middle of a coconut grove. It was really gorgeous. And homeschooling the children, but due to my stubborn left-wing Labour voting principles, I would not have servants, which meant that things were actually pretty exhausting. And we got rice direct from the paddy, which meant that it had a lot of grit and feathers in it. And so it took a couple of hours of the afternoon, and I made the kids pitch in to prepare the evening meal. And it was pretty tiring. And after they went to bed, I tapped out a short story on this little portable manual typewriter, which was subsequently stolen. And I mailed it back to the Atlantic Monthly, which is a prominent literary magazine in the States. I was not at all confident that it would get there because there was just one mailbox in this village, and we had seen the mailman on his rickshaw collect the mail, and various letters would float out over the paddy. So I thought it was a 50-50 chance of whether it would ever reach its destination, but it did, and it was published. So that I suddenly thought, oh, I could do this instead of my dissertation. That's how it started.
Wow. I'm fascinated by the similarities between Queensland, the place that you said is yours psychically, you feel at home, and the American South where you live for many years. And I think that those similarities and those two worlds come together quite beautifely in your story, the Republic of Outer Barcoo, where you actually have a gun-toting religious nut from the south who moves to Queensland and attracts locals.
As they would, wouldn't they?
I just wondered if you could talk a bit about those similarities and perhaps also that story.
Well, of course, I visited that turf a lot when I was writing Oyster, and like most Australians, we hug the coasts. We're city people. We're urban people. And even when I was posted for my first year as a high school teacher, it was north of Cairns. It was Queensland's northernmost high school at the time, but it was on the coast. And it wasn't until the 1990 last major inundation of Queensland, when the western town of Charleville was under 6 feet of water, that Laurie Muller, who was at that time head of UQP, got this brilliant idea that was full of goodwill and also very useful to him as a publisher, of taking a writer's train out to Charleville and stopping at every little town on the way and giving readings, and that we would donate all this money to Charleville to rebuild the town library, which had been flooded. And it was quite an interesting bunch. I mean, Tom Keneally, Tim Winton, Thea Astley. Due to my age, I can't at this moment remember everybody who was on that list, but we had a great time. And it picked up a lot of media attention, and it was on the 7:30 report and so on. And it was my first time actually into the real outback. And I was fascinated by it, and it was the happenstance of being there when the whole brouhaha about Waco, Texas, and David Koresh was reaching the international airwaves, and that was that cricket ball moment when I thought, oh, that could happen in Western Queensland. And that was the start of the novel. And then I realized I really needed to keep going back there. I really need... The way I write, or the way I feel I need to write, is I have to completely physically know that environment. I have to know what the air smells like, what the temperature's like, what the rain is like. I mean, is it Melbourne drizzle or is it real Queensland rain? That sort of thing. And I felt, I don't know what is the fly season in the outback. I don't know what the mosquito season is in the outback. Well, I found the fly season is all year round, and the mosquito season is only every few years when there's rain. It's just too dry for mosquitoes. But I kept going back and sort of got hooked on the outback. So I had done a lot of that when I wrote Oyster. Then I'm in South Carolina, and I read this article in the New York Times about a religious group in Texas, and I've worked the text of that into the story. Fair dinkum was a New York Times article. They have seceded from the state of Texas. They have their own currency. They have passports. It just seems so completely wacky. And but then I know there are people in South Carolina like that, and I know perfectly well, even though Peter Beattie has changed the logo of Queensland from the Sunshine State to the Smart State, and is a lot smarter than it was when I was growing up. Still, there are a lot of strange people on the western side of the Great Divide. And so it just seemed to me so logical to take this article about the little religious secessionist group in Texas and have them start in South Carolina and move them on to Queensland. It just seemed a logical progression to me.
And those similarities that you've talked about between the South and Queensland, what are some of those things that you said made you feel at home, and like you'd actually, South Carolina was like the place you'd grown up?
I've taken to saying that there. I grew up in this state, except it was in Australia. All right, starting with some of the earlier parallels. Strom Thurmond and Joe Bjelke-Peterson, are like clones. They both ruled their states like feudal fiefdoms. They were corrupt. They were very devout church-going men who were extreme racists, and there are just a lot of similarities, and they both reigned for a very long time. Strom Thurmond became the senator for South Carolina when the year I started high school in Queensland. He was still the senator for South Carolina when I moved there in 1999, having been invited to that chair. And I remember at the end of my first year, I think on Strom's birthday, there would be a big party for him on the steps of the State House. It's a very impressive State House in Columbia, South Carolina, the capital. And there would be a huge party for him. And Strom declared in 2000, which was, I believe, his 97th birthday, that he had decided that when his term expired in 2003, he would not seek re-election. It's true. And he died in the saddle. I mean, he was still a senator for South Carolina when he died at the age of a bit over 100. Now, Joe would love to have held on for that long, but he didn't quite make it. So that's one of the similarities. There is very ugly racial history in South Carolina and in Queensland. When I went to South Carolina, I was really, really shocked that the Confederate flag, you know, the cross, the flag of the South in the Civil War, the uncivil war, was still flying as an official flag from the State House dome. And also it was the only state in the Union that still was not keeping Martin Luther King Day as an official holiday. So my first civic act, after having been in South Carolina not quite a year, was to join a march from one of the Black Baptist churches onto the State House demanding that the Confederate flag come down from the dome. 50,000 marches. And I'd been in South Carolina, you know, less than a year, but long enough to have immersed myself in reading the papers, and the national press considered South Carolina, a great embarrassment. South Carolina is sort of dig-in-your-heels stubborn on the whole, and they don't really care what the rest of the world thinks, which is something they also have in common with a lot of outback Queensland. But I did know that polls within South Carolina indicated that most people felt it had become an embarrassment, like a national embarrassment. And certainly because the NAACP were boycotting South Carolina, it was finally when the Chamber of Commerce had had enough. And there aren't many more conservative bodies than Chambers of Commerce wanted the flag to come down. So I knew that the tide of public opinion was about 70% of white public opinion, and the state is nearly 50-50 black population and white population. So I thought that there would be, a huge contingent of white marchers in this, and I'd marched in the 60s against Vietnam. It was kind of fun getting back into the swing of things. So I joined this march, 50,000 people, only about 5% of whom were white. And they tended to be university students and university faculty. So that was a bit of a shock to me, and it made me realize that although it had become embarrassing to white South Carolinians, the social consequences of joining a march or allying yourself, as it was seen really with the North, were too great for people to join that march. And in the South, by the way, it is never referred to as the Civil War. It is, in neutral terms, referred to as the war between the states, but quite often as the war of northern aggression. Most Australians don't realise that Yankee has a very specific meaning in America, and it means someone who was from the North and is on the Union side in the Civil War. And Yank is not a term Americans recognize about themselves. It's only what other people outside the country called them after the war. So, to be called a Yankee in the South is believe me, a derogatory term. And when I was first offered the position, I thought it was so weird because my predecessor was James Dickey, who wrote Deliverance and won the Pulitzer for poetry. So have you ever seen that really fantastic movie? James Dickey wrote the novel Deliverance, and he was a macho Southerner. And fairly racist, really, but a great poet. So I just thought it was so bizarre that I would be invited to to follow him. And I asked friends in Boston, don't you think this is weird? And they said, oh, those Southerners would much rather have an Australian than a Yankee.
That's terrific. And I mean, you explore that territory of the South so beautifully in some of your stories here, and also in Orpheus Lost. I just found it fascinating. And I wish I could ask you more, but I'm going to be unselfish and turn it over to the audience. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. And because we have so many of you and little time, if you could try to make it a question as short as possible. Yes.
Oh, thank you. I would like to ask you about the cruel people that you referred to. What did you find? Why are they that way? And why do people follow them?
Oh, you mean the character, the cult messiah figures who... You know, I write a whole novel to try to answer questions, and I don't always find the answer. I just very, very thoroughly explore the question. In that case, I'll tell you where the exploration led me, because my starting hunch was that these people did start out with idealistic reasons. I used to think that was true of Jim Jones. If you can remember back to that episode, he used to work with the black and the poor in San Francisco before he took them all off to Guyana in South America, and then there was a sort of enforced mass suicide. And that was the one I knew most about, or the only one I knew anything about, actually, when I was grabbed by the idea of the novel. And my starting out hunch was that these people were idealists who got corrupted by their own power. You know, that they had charisma and so many people flocked to them, they got corrupted by this and sort of turned into monsters. But I actually began a very assiduous and depressing and frightening reading program in psychology and on all the instances I could find of these cult messiahs. And there were a few proliferating at the time. Do you remember the Heaven's Gate group in suicides in California and in France? And these were all educated professional people, which made it all the more mysterious. And the more I read, and then the more I began to read in the phenomenon of psychopathy or psychopathy, the more I began to feel, no, these people didn't start out as idealists. They were from the start psychopaths. And the thing about psychopaths is they truly are like a black hole. They have no self. Psychiatrists who've given their lives to this don't really understand it either, but they have no cure prognosis. You know, these, for whatever reasons, usually did involve terrible childhoods, but not everybody with... In fact, only a very tiny minority of people with terrible childhoods turn into psychopaths. But they are people who have shut down the ability to feel. So it is absolutely impossible. They don't have feelings. So they become very acute observers and mimics of emotion and feeling. And because of that, they seem to be able to act like a mirror that people see in them whatever they need or want to see. So I used to think only needy people would be drawn to them, but that in fact seems not to be the case. It's very bewildering, and I really didn't find a complete answer, but I just realized that charisma can be evil as well as good. Hitler, after all, had charisma. And in the short story about the pedophile in Forecast Turbulence, that character is, the Prince of Darkness is a gentleman. He's so charismatic. Yeah, and so when I am writing stories about that, and that one, the story of the pedophile, is happened in the town we were living in. So that was we knew people devastatingly affected by that. Really, I'm writing about the devastation caused in the lives around them, and how those people cope with it.
Thank you.
Can I just ask you, do you think they're born? People are born psychopaths?
You probably at the back can't. That someone in front asked, "Do I think people are born psychopaths?" You know, I think even psychologists and psychiatrists don't know the answer to that fully. They really don't. And I read very widely in the field. Can't answer it. But I know they apparently are not curable. You know, they're not amenable to treatment.
Thank you. Do we? Yes.
In your teaching, were you able to introduce any Australian literature? And if so, which writers were you interested in introducing?
When I've been actually teaching in American universities, I've always asked and never been allowed to teach a course on specifically Australian lit, but I always will teach theme courses and sneak in a book or two. On the other hand, when I've been doing visiting stints at various universities, that's usually been connected to people on the Commonwealth Literature Circuit. And so I have given talks on other books. I've talked on Christina Stead. And a nice little serendipity occurred in the past month because I was teaching. I have been teaching a huge public course, a crowd as big as this, free for the University of South Carolina, to the public, and it was free for them to come. And I would give a lecture on a book on Monday evenings, and either have the author there on Wednesday evening, or sometimes show a movie. And so I did The Rabbit-Proof Fence, and gave a lecture on the book Monday evening, and showed the movie Wednesday evening. And the day I was giving the lecture, I got an email from the Perth Festival asking if I would be willing to spend a day at Albany and to do a reading on the Amity. And Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, the novel opens with the arrival of the Amity in Albany Harbour and the founding of the first European settlement in Western Australia. So that sort of was a startling synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence that it just, the very day I was lecturing on that novel, I get invited to read on the Amity. And I did do that, and it was wonderful. It was raining and drizzly, so we had to go. The reading was going to take place on deck, and we all had to crowd down into the hold of this lovely little tub with two masts. It makes you wonder how on earth these frail little things got across an ocean. But that will always be a high point memory, huddled in the hulk of the Amity, reading a story in which I mentioned the Amity because the Amity, it's in the memoir about my mother's death in the book, because before the Amity sailed from Sydney to Albany, Oxley used it to chart the Brisbane River, and he anchored the boat by a creek above which Wesley Hospital in Brisbane now stands. So the spot where the Amity was anchored is above which was the place where my mother died. So I read that passage on the Amity, which was another nice little fusion of unexpected moments.
It's lovely. Do we have... yes.
I just love your work. But what I can't understand
I wish
is...
I could see you. Where are you?
What I can't understand is how you've never won a Booker Prize. And in fact, I don't know whether you've ever been shortlisted, but you may or may not wish to comment on this.
I have been long-listed a couple of times, but no, I have never been shortlisted. Of course, it's nice. It's nice to be listed for prizes, and it's certainly very nice to win them. And I had begun to think that if I ever were to win an Australian Literary Prize, it would be posthumously. But on the other hand, I got such an incredibly lucky start. I mail a story back from South India that's hand-typed on thin parchment pages, and it gets published in a major literary magazine in the States. And it was the editors of The Atlantic who suggested that there was more than a short story here, that I should expand it into a novel, because it's about cross-cultural misunderstanding, Westerners not understanding Hindu culture and South Indian culture not understanding us. I was very flattered, but at the time, remember, I'd been writing academically and never really thought about becoming a writer. And now I had done a short story, and I thought, wow, that's what I can do, short stories. I can't make people live long enough to be in a novel. But we were actually very short of money at the time, because we were on sabbatical on very reduced salary. And I said to the editors of The Atlantic, what kind of advance would you give me if I did this? And they were rather taken aback and said, well, we don't actually usually give advances on an unfinished manuscript to an unknown author. But if you get us 100 pages that we like, we'll give you $1,000. Well, I felt like winning the lottery at that point, so I whipped out that 100 pages very quickly. And then it took me a lot longer. It took me another few years to actually finish the novel. But then that novel won Canada's biggest literary prize, and was simultaneously published in Canada and the US and England. So I felt that I got all of that front-loaded, and that I could just concentrate on the pleasure of writing and setting new challenges for myself. I mean, writing a novel is such best metaphor for it I ever heard was from William Styron, who wrote Sophie's Choice and The Confessions of Nat Turner. I mean, a really fine novelist who writes big novels. And I heard him once say on a interview show, oh, writing a novel, it's like setting out from Rome to Vladivostok on your knees. And it is a bit like that. So the only way I can sustain the kind of energy for the marathon of a novel is to make it very, very difficult, to make it... In other words, each time, I have to raise the bar each time, and I have to be pretty certain when I'm starting out that either it's not doable or that I'll fall flat on my face. And there's the excitement, and that's what keeps you going until you figure out how to do it.
Well, thank you for that. That was fascinating. And sadly, that's all that we have time for. But thank you very much to everyone for coming, and thank you so much to Janette Turner Hospital for the conversation. I would just like to say that books are available at the back of the hall, and Janette will be available for signing. Please join me.
So should we tell them, do I stay here to sign or do I go up there? Does anybody know the answer to that question?
I'll tell you.
I go up there.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you, Janette.